Okay, only two people. Let me see for a few more minutes. Hey Nagaram, yep. Hi.
Hi, Preeti.
Can you ask the UI developers to join? I'm not sure if they are in the previous call, but like I would recommend this is one of the useful things that at
Yeah,
least you should know the basics. So yeah, if you're in
yeah,
the
okay.
office, just ping them to join the call.
Yeah, I'll ping them, but I'm not in office. Okay.
Okay, okay. Yeah, Laya and Manga.
Yeah, sure, I'll ping them.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Good afternoon, everyone. So let's start the session. So I just want to give a recap of like what all things that we have seen in the last call. So let me start sharing. Or if you have any questions, we can start with your questions. Okay. Or just keep it at the end as well, and that should be fine. So I think in the last call, like we are going through like what is the unit testing and what is the test case and why do a developer needs to write the unit test, right? And also after that we went through the Jasmine framework. So with the package.json, we have seen the Jasmine and the karma related dependencies which we get within the Angular project. And then we went through the configuration of the karma file to understand the basic things that we require. So, and after that, we went to the test.ts file to see like if you want to have run only test case for a specific file, right? So how do we manage it? So that is the start. That is a startup file for the karma to run the test cases. So we have gone through that test file and then we just went through a sample application like app.component.spec.ts and we just saw like how is that karma test runner being opened, and then we went through the code coverage. If you want to add a code coverage within the karma file, you need to set a criteria. If you want to set a criteria, you need to set it over here. And if you want to enable it, you need to add the code coverage flag as true within the options in the angular.json. So once the code coverage is given, we also saw the folder, right, that is being created, and how is it showing us the code coverage. So within the components, we saw this user data. So yeah. So yeah, we saw the code coverage report as well, and later we were discussing on the keywords, like the main keywords that we have within a test file, like the describe, it, fixture, before each, what is a fixture and why do we need to do this detect changes and all, right? So those are the basic things that we have covered in the previous session. And along with that, we also discussed one more thing, that is the Angular testing library. So in order to have the, so default when you
Ex-
create a yeah,
Priti,
yeah.
some of them are asking for the link, meet link.
Yeah, share with them.
Don't have it.
If did they join the previous call?
Yeah. Okay, they share that link.
Yeah,
It's
share
fine.
that. Okay. Uh, Along with that, so where am I? So Angular testing library, right? So we installed this library, Angular testing library, which will have like compared to the existing spec file that Angular creates for us, this testing library helps us to test the DOM events. Like it's something like how a real user tests the application. So you can see that difference between the regular test case, the test file, and the test file that we create using the Angular testing library. So after that, like we were just going through one example of this Angular testing library, right? So now let's go deep and dive with this testing library, how it is actually coming into picture. So in our existing file, right? So we have covered, if we go back to this, right? So we have covered this ng on in it. So let's cover, try to understand what this functionality is and how do we cover these methods. So let's look into this toggle, right? So this toggle uses data. So when it is being called, if you go into this HTML, right? So there is a toggle button here, and on change, I'm just calling this method. Okay, so this input change, you need to call this method, and then what we are setting, the target dot checked. It's nothing but the event DOM event, right? So the DOM event dot checked property is something we are setting it to a global variable, which is show users data. So when the toggle is checked, if the checked property is true, then the show users data will be as true. So now we need to test this toggle functionality. So how with the existing approach that we have, right, without using this Angular testing library, we cannot test this DOM events. So that is the reason. Now you can see the difference how we can test it. So let's start writing a test case to test this. Like you can have it. It is nothing but specific to each test case. So I'm writing a test case to check this toggle. It should toggle or something. The text should be relevant to that. And now I need to get my HTML so that I can click on this input. Like I can change this input so that this method gets triggered. This is what will happen even in the real case, right? Once this HTML is loaded, you will click on this toggle button and this change will be triggered. And then the property will be set to true or false based on the checked property. That is what you want to achieve it even in your test case. So how do you do it? First, you need to get your component. So const get by id. Okay. So what it is doing? So with this Angular testing library, right, we have a properties called like get by test ID, get by label element, where you can read your DOM elements. Okay. So here get by test ID is nothing but if you look into this input, right, this input has a property data test ID. Okay, it's nothing but this is some ID to that element. The difference between this ID is this ID you cannot access directly in the spec file. So if we add this test ID, this is nothing but for your test cases. Or if you have any text, right? If you don't have this ID and if you have text something, you can also use get by label text. So let's go into this and see what all properties we have. So if you look into this, right, this is nothing but queries.d.ts. It's a compiled file. So if you see this path, right, from where it is coming, it's coming from node modules, testing library, DOM, so and types. So the testing library gives us all the DOM features where we can access within our spec files. Okay, so that is the like main usage of this testing library where you can do some real testing. So here you can see like many properties you have to just query the DOM element. You can use any of this according to your preference, like how your HTML behaves. So at this point, I have just data test ID property. So I'm just using get by test ID. Okay, if you want to get it by role, find by role. Okay, like mostly we'll be having like get by label text. If you have a label within your HTML, right, you can use this get by label, get by text, or if you have a direct text, you can use get by text, or you can use this label text. Most probably we'll be using label text or get by test ID. It depends upon your HTML. So how your HTML has these properties, you can just try with any of these just to read your HTML. Okay. So this is a syntax how we write it. So we just make the component to get by test ID. Okay. So now your component has this get by test ID. So which ID should I read? So let me take some input variable, input some ID input variable. So now I need to get by test ID of. So what is my ID that I'm passing? So you need to get this ID, right, in order to read that particular input element. This is nothing but the declaration part. Here I am just getting the test ID. It's nothing but the given. Here I'm executing. It's nothing but both are equal to given. So I'm just getting my get by test ID. So it's nothing but it will get this input element. Okay. Once you have your input element ready, what you need to do? You need to perform a change event on your input element, right? You need to perform this change event on your input element so that this method gets triggered and whatever logic within the change happens, you should test that particular change. So in order to do that, we have a fire event. Okay, if you see this fire event is also coming from this testing library. Okay, it's nothing but it takes all your DOM events. Okay, if you just click on dot and you can see like you will find all your DOM events like change, click, the regular things that we use like change, click, or focus, input, invalid, key press, key down. All these are the DOM events that you see. Okay. So now what we are doing here, we are just changing it, right? So change. What are we changing? We are changing this input element. It's not like ID, or you can just name it as input element EL. Okay. This is my input element. I'm just changing my input element. So whenever you're changing, you can also give this change property, right? So if you want to specify the property, right? So input element has nothing but target. What is the event target that we have? And you can mention it like if it is checked, colon, true or false. That is what your event has, right? Event will have target dot checked. So you can mention like target checked, true or false. It depends if you want to on it or off it. You can test any of the scenarios. Okay, so here I'm just giving whatever initialization part is needed. I'm just giving that. And here I'm doing the execution part. So the third part of a test case is nothing but to verify. So what am I going to verify here? What can we verify? We can verify whether this show users data is being updated to this value, right? In toggle user data, what are we doing? We're just setting one global variable to the value that has come from the event. So here you can just check instance dot show users data. It should be dot So you can see this expect dot has many methods, like you can see to be closed, to be defined, to be falsy. It depends upon the test case that you're testing. If you want to test it to be that the value should be null, you can just use this method to be of null. If you want it to be like, if you're comparing some in number values, right? If you're comparing some integers like less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. So it depends upon the use case that you are using. You have many things here, like to have been called. If you want to test whether that function has been called or not, or how many times it has been called, if you want to mention those times, right? One time, two time, you can mention those things. Like you have all methods where this the test cases can be tested out. So now here I'm testing just it should be true. Now let's run that quickly. Oh, okay. The problem here is in our component itself, we have created this show users to be true, right? So let's make this as false default. So you can see this toggle, right? This toggle also previously it was false. That's the reason like it's not toggling. So you can see this toggle became true, and let's see this file. Even in the code coverage, we are able to see this show users data is covered. And even in this, you have seen this toggle is also toggled in the test runner. So this is just the initial approach that I just mentioned for a quick example. So it depends on examples that you have within your HTML, right? Here I just have a change event I have added. If you want any input event or if you want to do any click event, you can do that. It's just needed to get the element. You just need to read that input element and perform that event on that input element and just expect whatever you want to expect it from the TS file. Okay, so this is for the toggle. Let's also see how we do for this navigation, right? So where are we calling this navigate method? So if we go back to the HTML, so there is a button close here. On click of that button, we are calling navigate to thank you. And what are we doing here? We are doing router.navigate of thank you. So let's write one more test for this. Okay. So first what we need, same like this. So first we need to do the given steps, like what initialization of whatever needed for our test case. So here I have a button, right? So here my button already has some text which is close, right? So here which property I can use directly to just read that button. I can use get by text. Directly with the text also you can read this button. Okay. So I just created a component with get by text. Now let me get my button. So get by text of the label, the button label is close. So now I just got my button. Now what I need to do, I need to perform an action. I need to execute it. So call the fire event dot. So what is the method that we are calling here? We are doing the click operation, right? So in the spec file dot click. Okay, so you're just clicking on this button. Okay, so initialization part is done, execution part is done. Now you need to expect something. What do you need to expect here? Go to the TS file. So what is happening on click of this button? We are doing this router.navigate to some a thank you page, right? So you need to test the router.navigation method here. So for testing this router dot navigation, we need to first spy on that router. So yesterday someone was asking what is spy on, right? So spy on is nothing but it will track the calls and the arguments. Like you no need to have the real implementation. So you no need to have the real router and everything. You just need to spy on that method, and it will like spy on that existing the methods that we have within that router, and it will give you something like the real data. Okay. So for this, we need to spy on this router. So here there is a spy on of router. Spy on takes two params. One is the object that we need, and the second parameter is the method that you need to spy on that object. Okay. From the router, I need to spy on which method here. We are calling this navigate method, right? So you need to spy on this navigate method. Okay, why it's telling cannot find name router, because you first need to define your router. So how do we define it? First, let's create let router. Okay, and you can create and just take an instance of your router testbed dot inject. You're just taking an instance of the router class. Okay. So this is the router. You're spying on this navigate method within the router. So now what do you expect? So since you already have your spy, you just expect your router dot navigate. So what are you doing in the TS file? You're just the router dot navigate is being called with some parameters to navigate to that particular page, right? So router dot navigate dot to have been called. So I just spoke of like there are few function methods, right, to call. So now I want to use to have been called with, because I have a parameter here that needs to be called with. If you don't have anything, if it is an empty function, you can just use to have been called. If you have any parameters that you want to pass, you can use to have been called with. With what is my param here? Just like thank you. Okay. So this is what I'm just expecting from my test case. So I have, so it depends. So Spyon can be used based on your like the code, right? Now, since I have router, I'm just taking a router. Say, suppose if you have any services like your local services, and if you want to spy on that particular method from that service, right? Say, suppose if you have some API service within your local file, and if you want to call a method within that local file like put or something, it's nothing but you will take this API service. You should create instance, take an instance from the API service, and then just spy on that put method. Okay, so and then you can expect anything from that like based on the logic that you have. So since we have only router here, we are taking the router and we are asking it to navigate. So you can use any properties within the router, right? Router dot URL. We also have router dot URL, right? If you want, you can use URL property. It depends upon the logic that you're actually using. Since I'm using here navigate method, I'm just using the navigate. Okay, let's see what's happening here. Okay, so now what is this error? So testing library error should navigate. What it is happening, this could be because the text is broken by multiple elements. So this error, if you see, if you read into this error, right, it's telling that we are not able to find the element with the text close. So where are we finding this element? We are trying to find this element here, right? So it's telling that in the HTML we are not able to find this element. So what can we do to fix this kind of things, right? Because here the problem here is once this test cases run in the order that you have written, right? So when you're running this test case, the first test case will be done and your component will be fetched. Next, it will go to this test case and the logic will be triggered. Then it will go to this test case. So it needs some change detection to happen so that it will identify this particular text. So ideally our HTML, see, you can see the below HTML as well. Here you don't have the close. What all things you're having here? You're having only like show user info or input. So you're not having that close to be loaded here, right? Why it is not loaded here? Because in the HTML for the close button to be loaded, we are using this ng if show users data. Since this is false, it's not being, it's even here you can see this HTML is also not loaded here, right? You are not seeing this HTML here. So let's just add a flag to be true within this particular test case. And see what it is doing. So these are the most like common errors that you will get when you're using this H testing library to read any DOM elements, right? But it's very simple. You'll also get this HTML logic here. If you're not getting HTML, go and find the logic why it is not loading. Still, if it is not loading, it's nothing but your component change has not been triggered. So it needs a change detection to read your component. For the change detection to be triggered, the logic that we add is nothing but you need to mention fixture dot detect changes. So this fixture is a wrapper for both your TS and HTML. So it's going to detect the changes and again you should be able to see this text. So first let's see this and okay. Still it is not detecting, right? So what you need to do, let's add this detect changes before you read the HTML, the text. Before you read this text, let's add this line. Okay. So now you can see all your three test cases are passed here, right? You saw this difference, right? Between add without having this detect changes and with having the detect changes, right? Because we are already using these particular instance variables in the previous test cases we are assigning, right? And now again, if you're just changing it to true, your component should detect this change so that it gets reloaded in the HTML. So if you don't add this one line, your test case will fail because your test case is not identifying this change here. It's still taking the previous change. Okay, so that is the reason the fixture dot detect changes is very important in a test case to identify its change. Okay, so now let's see the code coverage. Okay, so now you can see the entire file is covered. Okay. So yeah, these are the common things that we do while we want to test any fire event. So we already saw how like change event get by element, like how do we get read the DOM elements, and then you expect that router dot navigate. Okay, so along with this, like since this is a small example, you really don't need to have some huge data set to be built in your local, right? You're just so initially to get the user's information, what are we doing here? We are using this mock object, right? So this mock object contains the response that we actually have in a real case. Like when you test the application, what is the whatever response you get from the database, we are just mocking it with some sample test data, right? So we have one more concept like called the factories where you can use to create your mock objects. Okay, so what is a factory means nothing but in the factories.ts file. So you just create a TS file for factories. When do we really need to use this factories is say suppose now you have this mock object, right? So you have a logic where you want to test when you're say suppose like if this mock, right, if this user's data like users dot length is greater than Let me write it in the TS file. Okay, now I'm getting this user's information, right? Say suppose you have this logic, if this dot users dot some length greater than 20, I want to do something, I want to display something or do something. There is some action to be taken here. Okay. So how can you achieve, like, how do you test this particular if condition? When will you be able to test it? You will be able to test it if you have this user response dot length greater than 20, right? So here we are not getting the actual, like the real data from the database. We are just mocking the responses. So in such case, what you will do, actually what I'm doing here, the get users info, we are already mocking it to return some mock object. But currently my mock object is having only like 1, 2, 3, 4, only 4 users information. But that is not sufficient for me to test this particular logic, right? Because I need to have some length like 20, like I need to have some 20 users information and then only I will be able to test this logic. So what you will do? You cannot like go ahead and add the objects here, right? You cannot go ahead and add like 20 users information here, right? So in such cases, or if you like, if in cases where you really don't want to do like mocking, right? You don't want to add multiple things, or even there is one more case, right? Say suppose your object is like this, right? So in the next object, you just want to change entire data is same. You just want to change your phone number to a different phone number. Okay. In such case, you no need to mock the entire object. So here the first name, last name, address, everything is same. Only the phone number is different, right? So for this, you no need to add a separate object. You can use this existing object and you can just rename that particular, just add a difference of this phone number. So in such cases, right, we have this factories. So first you need to create a factory.ts. I already have it created. Okay. This is nothing but a factory.ts. There will be no logic within it. It's just like your model. It's just like my model, my user data. Within that, I already added what all objects that I want to have. First name, last name, address, email, and phone. Okay. And here I'm using this overrides. Overrides is nothing but whenever you call this method, it will override all these properties except the one that you have passed within your method. Okay. Say suppose you want to create one more user data with all the fields similar to this, but you want to just change only the phone number. So what you can do is you can just from your spec file, right? You can create factories from, ideally you will be using this object to mock the data, right? So you want to mock this users information. So in such cases, you will be using it. So how you can do, you can just create some, I want the entire object, but only the phone number to be different. So how can I do? I can just create a user factory where I need to call that factories method that I have created. So let me first import this. Okay, so factories dot, I already have this user data, right? So within this user data, I'll send a partial object. You can see this user data tag takes a param as partial object. It's not the entire object. So I'll just pass the partial object phone to be something. Okay. I'm just sending the partial object, not the entire object. And this is what my user factory will take. Okay. And this user factory, you can use it to just return your mock object. Okay, so these kind of factories, right? In simple applications or simple logic, you won't be like, you won't see much difference using these factories. But when you work into a large applications, right? In this example, ideally, it's not needed to make use of factories. But whenever you have huge data coming from the database and you have only a minor condition that that your response may vary, right? Every case you won't see the same response, right? Depends upon your workflow, the response may change. So in such cases, if you want to just mock your response, you no need to call the entire or use the entire mock object. You can just use these factories and change the partial data from that factory. So what is this user factor is going to return? it's going to return this entire object, but the phone number will be different. But you will see all details are same. Okay, so you understood the usage of this factories, right? So whenever you want to create response with just the minor change in the model, but not the entire model change. So you no need to like duplicate the mocking within the mock file. You can just use this factory so that it will change only the particular object. That is why we are using here partial. It's not the entire object that you are passing here. You'll just pass the partial method and it will override. That's why it overrides, right? It's going to override that particular key value pair here, and the entire like the keys will be the same within that object. So you will see this usage, like the help of this in huge applications. But yeah, just keep in mind like you can use this factories for these kind of examples. Hmm. Okay, I think from the TS file, I think we are clear. We have covered some minor concepts on this. So now let's move to our service file. Okay, we also have one service file. So this TS file you understood, right? Any TS file or any component or TS file, it's the same thing that we actually follow. One more thing to be noted here is uh, here if you have any input or output properties, right? You know, right? You will be using this at the rate input or at the rate output. When do you use these properties? When there is any parent to child communication between the components, you use this input and output, right? If you want to test those properties, right? How do you test? So this Angular testing library makes it easier for us. Like it has this component properties where you can just give your input or output properties here. You can just pass it with your component properties. Say suppose if I have at the rate input of some ID, I'm just passing an ID to be a string. I'm just passing an ID as my input. Okay. So for this ID, you can just give this input property ID colon. I'm just passing it as a string, some A1 or something. Okay, so you can use this component properties to just like tell your spec file that you have some input property coming from a parent or a child component. You can use this component properties. Okay, so these are just the basic things that we come across in a component.ts file. So let's move to a service file to understand this HTTP calls, right? So what do we have in a service file? We have this HTTP call. So how do we test the HTTP calls? Because we cannot really go ahead and call the HTTP and do the testing, right? So now I'm just changing in my test.ts file. I'm changing it to service file just to make the service. So this is common. It's either a service component or any pipe or any files you have. It's just changing the file name here. So my service file already have the basic outlet here. So let's go and see what logic that we want to test within this spec file. So if we go into this TS file, I have two methods. One is get users info and one is get users info with HTTP. Okay, so how do we test this HTTP methods, right? API calls. So in Angular to test this HTTP calls, right? We have a HTTP client testing module which will easily mock this HTTP requests. Whatever HTTP request we have, it will easily mock the HTTP request and it will give us the response. Like you can mock the response using the HTTP testing controller as well. So let's use this. So how, in order to have it, first we need to import the HTTP client testing module. So since we have this HTTP client using in the service, right? So let's import HTTP client testing module. Okay. So this HTTP client testing module will give us a service which is called the HTTP testing controller. Okay, so let's first focus on this method, and once we get into this method, I'll explain like how we use that controller. Okay, so first focus on this method, which is nothing but get users info. So let's test this method, get users info. So in get users info, what are we doing? So here we are just returning off of some data, which is nothing but off is nothing but it's an observable data, right? So you need to do some observable like the asynchronous testing here, right? So in Angular, we have three ways of doing this asynchronous testing, right? So let's do not take everything at once. Let's do one kind of testing here. So for this get users info, how do I write a test case? So first let me take some const user info equal to. So I already created an instance for my service, right? It's same. Any component or service or any file, if you want to create an instance, is nothing but testbed.inject. So my instance dot, so you can access all the methods within the service. So get users info. So I'm first getting the user info from, I'm just calling this method get users info. So what I need to test here, I need to test whether this particular user info is equal to this observable value, right? I need to test that the written object is equal to the object that I am actually taking it from the service, the method. So how can I test it? So this user info is the observable here for us, right? Because here we are returning off of user info. So user info. Just a second. Okay. So this user info is actually an observable here because we are returning off of user info. So how can I test this observable? I need to do some subscribe here in order to get that response, right? So I'm just doing subscribe response. This subscribe is something similar how we do in the TS file. So I'm subscribing it and then I'm checking the response. So for the observables, how can you test the response? If you want to test the value within the observable, you need to subscribe that observable, then only you can test the response, right? So that is what we are also doing in the TS file. I'll check my response to equal of. So what is my response here? It's nothing but the mock object. Okay. So whenever we have the subscriptions or asynchronous testings that like asynchronous code of block of testing that we need to do, so Jasmine has a built-in way to handle this async code. Okay, it's nothing but we have a done function where we take it as the second parameter done function. This is not, this entire param is taken as the done function where we tell Angular that our asynchronous function is executed. So once this subscription is done, we need to tell that all our async function is executed so that you can close the open request. So this is the way of handling the asynchronous logic. Okay. So what actually has is Jasmine has this async code way of handling using this done function. Okay, so once after every like your verification code is done, you need to call this done method so that what it will do is it will let us know that there are no any promises or anything like all any subscriptions are done there. Those are already completed. So you can it means that your subscription is completed. So how we use in the TS file, right? Whenever you have these subscriptions, how do we do? In order to tell that your subscription is completed, you do this unsubscribe in after on the ng on describe or whenever your subscription is completed, you unsubscribe it, right? In order to avoid this memory leaks and all, you unsubscribe it. That is the same way in the test cases. Whenever you have this async code, you need to tell after your subscription is completed, you need to call this done method, so that it will tell that all the whatever intercepts or whatever promises that we have within this observable, like we are telling that it is completed. So this is the ideal way to use whenever you want to test an async block of code. Okay, there are also different ways of testing the asynchronous like logic using like fake async or async and when stable. There are multiple flow like things that you can also use, but keep in mind this done, which is simple, right? To understand that your subscription is done and you have completed your subscription part. Okay, I'll give you a few more examples on fake async, but just keep in mind this is a simpler one, so I just used it here. So now we need to, where is my test runner? Okay, so you can see both are covered. Okay, so you understood, right? Keep in mind this done. It's very simple. You're just passing a done function and you're calling it once you're like you're telling that all your asynchronous code is completed. Okay, so also you want to check the code coverage, you can go ahead and see in the app, in the services, we have this test service.ts. You can see this block is covered. So now let's take a look into this HTTP calls, right? This is very important. Even this one is also very important because wherever you want to test some async block of code, remember to use this done, so that you're telling that all your pending asynchronous activities are completed. Okay, just like how you do unsubscribe after your subscriptions are completed, the similar way in the test case. Okay, now let's focus on the HTTP call. This is a little tricky. So these HTTP calls, right? You cannot use like in real world, you cannot call the HTTP like method endpoint and you cannot test it. So how can you test it? So you need to use this HTTP client testing module. So I'm just making use of this method name. Okay, so this HTTP client testing module will allow us to easily mock this HTTP request. Okay, how can you mock this HTTP request? It will also give us a HTTP testing controller service. I know like it's a bit difficult to understand, but if you go in with the example, it will be clear. So first, let's divide like how we do like the initialization part, right? So for the initialization part, let me take some response. So what do you want to test here? You want to test whether this get is giving some response, right? So first take some initialization steps here. Say suppose I'm taking my response to be like user info mock. I want this HTTP call to give a response which is nothing but my user info mock. Okay. Now let me take this API response. So my API, I'm just declaring my API response and service dot get users info dot, and I'm just mocking it. I'm telling that this method will return a response which is equal to my like which I'm assigning it to API response. So what I'm doing here, I have taken a variable API response and I'm telling that this particular method, right? It's nothing but it is returning observable again. So what I'm doing, I'm just subscribing it and I'm telling that I'm just storing that response in one global variable here. Okay. I'm just storing this like this method response to one global variable API response. Okay, now what I need to do, I need to request, right? This is nothing but the request call, right? From the client side, we are requesting the API with this particular URL. So my request, what is my request? So we have this HTTP testing controller. So let me declare this HTTP testing controller. The module that we have imported, right? This module will provide us this controller as a service to test our request objects. So we just need to import it in the same way. Testbed dot inject HTTP testing controller. Okay, see both of these modules and controllers are coming from this HTTP testing. Okay, so I have my controller here. So now I need to request my controller. It's nothing but see what we are doing here. This HTTP.get is nothing but it will request the API controllers, right? API endpoints. Here we cannot directly go and request the API controller. So we are just taking a mock controller, which is nothing but the HTTP testing controller. If you just have some knowledge on API, like how we have this controllers, we are just taking a mock controller, which is a HTTP testing controller. Okay, here I will write this controller has many methods. I'm using expect one. Okay, expect one. So I'm giving my URL. What URL I'm passing it to my controller. So controller will have a URL, right? Based on the URL, the controller will go and hit that particular endpoint or the method within the URL. So I'm just expecting my controller to be equal to this URL. Okay, so this is my request which I need to hit to get the response. So I'm just giving my controller and expecting it to be this particular URL. So now you can write expect, you can verify whether your request dot. So this is not, it will hold the request body. So request dot body. You're doing this verification, sorry, method request method. So I'm checking whether my request method is to equal of get. This is one of the verification that we can do. Okay, I'm just mocking it to my, I'm just mocking, telling my mock controller that you expect this as the URL. It is just expecting this URL. But in the verification part, we are verifying whether this is a get request or a, it depends. If it's a put request, you can verify whether it is a put or you can verify it's a post. So I'm just verifying my request method is get. Okay, along with this expect, you can also expect whether your response as well. You can also check your response. Here I'm just checking my request method, right? Along with that, I can also check my response. In order to check my response, you need to complete your request, right? Here I haven't completed my request. It's still in process. I'm just requesting here. But if I need to complete that, how do you get a response? Once your request is completed, you get a response back from the server, right? In order to complete your request here, you need to use request.flush. So you're telling that please complete my request with this particular response. I'm using this as the response. Okay, I'm telling that this is my request and complete this request. This flush operator is telling that complete the request with this as the response. Okay, now I can expect my response as well. So if you look into this previously, right? Previously, we already created some like we already defined like this method is going to return this response. So now you can verify where you can check that this API response is nothing but to equal of your actual HTTP response. Maybe. This looks little confusing, but just it's very easy. If you understand it, it is easy. Initially, what we are doing here, the first step is we are storing, we are calling that method and we are storing that response somewhere in some global variable. Okay, just to use it for the future. So now going into the actual logic, this is the execution part that we are doing. So we have this testing controller where we tell it to expect this particular URL. Okay, so here the request will happen. So the HTTP request will start here. Okay, since the request is happening, I can also test my request method, right? Because here the request is not completed, we are requesting it. So we can access the request method here. So I'm just expecting my request method to be get. So if you have any post APIs, you can expect, you can also verify whether it is post or get or something. Okay, once your request is done, I want to verify my response as well. So in order to complete your request, you need to use this request dot flush. With what you want to flush? Flush means what you want to give it as a response. How do you want to flush it out? So I want to flush it with a response with some mocked response. So this API call is returning my response. So now I can expect my previous one that I have declared, right? Just I initialized with the method. So I can verify whether this response is equal to this response. So here we are doing two verifications. One verification at the request side. Okay. One verification is here where we are testing the request object. Okay. One verification is what we are doing we are testing the response body. This is what HTTP call will have, right? Request and response. This is what we need to test. You can see this is also success covered. Okay, let's change it to post and see if it is failing or not. Ideally, your test case should accept the criteria, right? If it's not meeting the requirement, it should ideally fail. See, it's expected to get, but it is expected get to equal post. It will directly tell you like what it is expected and what it is actually giving. That's why it's failing. It's expecting it to be get. Okay, so this is the way that you test your endpoints. For the first time, it will be little difficult, but if you understand the logic behind it, it's very easy. You're just doing a request here, testing your request, and the later point of time, you're telling it to flush out my response. You're testing your response. Okay, so yeah, I think I covered HTTP calls as well. So any questions on this? Or if you want me to repeat, I can repeat. So this asynchronous kind of testing and testing the HTTP calls is like really important when you really work on test cases, right? Since you people are not working at right now on the test cases, it's just like listening to it, but since you're not making use of it. But once you get into writing test cases, right, you will understand the value of these things, asynchronous testing and HTTP calls. Okay, that's fine. And try to understand at least the basic idea behind it so that tomorrow, if you look into some test cases, it shouldn't be something new to you. Like at least you should understand, like, okay, it's something that we already heard and we know some basic idea on it. Okay. So along with this asynchronous kind of testing, right, using this done, we also have different approaches where you can use async. You can use this async method as well to test this test cases. Okay, like just the difference is here you're calling your async method, and once after your async method is completed, you're calling this when stable. So for all asynchronous calls, right, what do you have? You have one method and you also have one completion property that you're telling that your asynchronous requests are completed. So this is to call the asynchronous method, and this when stable is nothing but it will tell that all your asynchronous logic or the asynchronous processing is completed. Similarly, how we have here, we have this done and we are calling this method when our asynchronous job is completed. In the same way, we have async and you have this when stable. So this will be called once after your asynchronous logic is completed. So you can also use this type of examples if you want to test. Along with that, we also have a third one, which is fake async. Okay, you're telling that to run in this fake async zone. and you have this tick. So similar to this, like once after, so this tick will run after all your asynchronous logic is completed. Okay, so you can mention it like tick is nothing but it will take some time. So if you want your asynchronous time, so all these asynchronous things will take some time to run the logic, right? So if you want to set some timeout to it, you can set like 20 to 10. So it will wait for that time and then it will run the next little block of code. Okay. So in real examples, you will have use of this fake async and tick. Okay. Okay, I think I covered. So does it make any sense on this topic or what are your views on it? I just want to listen from you. Is it helpful or I'll stop the record?